intention that they are praying for, a question that they are wrestling with, a perspective on whatever life might offer at that moment. And so, whenever we find ourselves at a kind of crossroads, when we are thinking more deeply about things, we ought to also check in on what is most fundamental. What is the foundation of our lives? Because if we get the fundamental questions wrong, well then we won't be able to resolve anything else fully that is built on top of that. As Catholics, this is a chance for us to ask the really fundamental question of why are we Catholic in the first place? It's a question that ought to go through our minds with some regularity, because being human, we always run the risk of taking things for granted. It seems to be what we are best at. It doesn't take long before we take things for granted, and so we have to step back and make sure that the foundation of our lives is more secure, that we are not just culturally responding to what's going on. Now, the basic reason why we are Catholic is because it is the perspective that gives us the fullest picture of reality. The fullest picture of who is God and who are we because of that. These are the questions central. If we get wrong the basic ideas of God's identity or our own, it is not likely that we're going to answer well with whatever else follows. Now, I want to offer to you one part of this fundamental discovery. One part that seems to be also a reality of being human. As we navigate our lives and try to make sense of things, as we face decisions and try to bear responsibilities, there is this question that kind of floats under the surface in our lives that we have to take seriously. And the question is, why aren't things better than they are? Why aren't things better than they are? We might ask that because of a personal burden that we are feeling at a given time in our lives. We might be questioning this as we look at the world around us, the country, the world, the church, whatever is going on that we think ought to be better. We wonder, why aren't things better than they are? Now that question, as it kind of floats under the surface, runs the risk of causing discouragement, frustration, irritation, all kinds of different mentalities and things that will lead us down the wrong path. So it is crucial that we acknowledge that question, that we see it in light of the question of who is God and who am I. So that we should bring the question of why aren't things better than they are to the surface, not under the surface. We should expose that question to the light of God and say, God, the reason I'm really asking this question is you're supposed to be God, and if you're really God, you can make it better than it is. Now, when we expose that question to the light, we feel bad. Because we're supposed to be people of faith who don't question God. But the truth is, we question God all the time and don't admit it. That's worse. So we need to surface the question, why are things not better than they are? Our Catholic faith gives us a way to answer this question. The other part of not raising the question is that it causes us to fail in charity as well, because we have a tendency to answer the question, the reason things aren't better is because of those people. Whoever it is that's causing my problem, if they would do things the way they should, everything would be better. And so it can lead us down this path of doubt, despair, hatred, lack of faith, all kinds of things that have to be sorted out if we're going to answer whatever question brings us on our pilgrimage. So then, what our Catholic faith gives us as a response to this is actually an entire history of the relationship of God with his people. Our Catholic faith is not something we invented. It is given to us by God because God has the one overarching desire to gather all his people to himself. And so he gives us the church. And so the church's understanding of every question is built on what God has revealed over time. An enormous part of what God has revealed is the promise of heaven. The promise that despite our rejection of God's plan, despite sin that was built on Adam and Eve and contributed to by all of us, God does not change his overarching desire to gather us to himself as part of his family. This is the promise of heaven. But here's the part of the promise that we need to get straight. God promises us heaven in heaven. And we live with this idea that God's supposed to give us heaven now. God never promised us that heaven is what we will discover along the journey. God tells us that heaven is the destination. That everything, let me repeat, everything that happens on the journey is meant to mold and shape our lives so that we're ready for the promise. God is using everything that takes place in our lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of it, as an opportunity to shape us so that the pilgrim journey is making us ready for heaven. God does not promise us heaven until heaven. Now, today's readings for this Sunday of Advent, they help us to understand. They give us two different comparisons, both using images from the natural world around us, but pointing to the interior reality of our very souls. And so in the prophet Isaiah, we hear this. The desert and the parched land will exult. The steppe will rejoice and bloom. They will bloom with abundant flowers and rejoice with joyful song. The desert, by the power of God, will bloom in abundant life that is impossible for the desert. In our second reading, we have St. James telling us, see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth. He plants the seed and he waits. And giving us this image, James reminds us multiple times in his short readings then, be patient, brothers and sisters, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits? You too must be patient. Make your hearts firm, because the coming of the Lord is at hand. But at hand does not mean already. And so these two images that use what we can observe in the natural world around us, they point to what God's desire is. The promise of God has nothing to do with the earth itself producing more fruit. It is an image meant to show what God can do in our souls. Whether it means seeds planted that take time to unfold, or whether it means that we experience the parched and desert kind of interior life where God can bring abundant life. And so why aren't things better than they are? Because we're still on the journey. Because it requires patience for the plan of God to bloom into new life. And so our pilgrim journey is meant to remind us that this is possible. Think about the saints that are the great example that we turn to, those who inspire us by their lives. How many saints do you respect because of how easy their lives were? The saints are saints precisely because the circumstances that surrounded them were seemingly impossible very often. That they faced the kind of struggles that we know are part of the human condition. And we admire them because in their interior life, they experience the abundant life of God. That regardless of what the world around them gave, instead of asking, why isn't this better than it is, they said, Lord, you are my strength. And with that strength, they overcome tortures, hardships, martyrdom, the very things that cause us to look at them and say, those are true pilgrims on the journey. They remind us of what God can do in a soul that is open to receive it. So, as you complete this particular Camino, as you come now to this celebration of the Mass, the culmination of this part of the journey, my prayer is that you will learn from those saints, that you will recognize a fundamental truth that God is present, and that as long as we live in a world that is broken by sin, there will be hardship. This is what God's promise is. But be patient, brothers and sisters. Make your hearts firm, because the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not complain, brothers and sisters, that you may not be judged, but rather, in whatever way your soul could be described as the desert and parched land, understand the power of God as you go. Because in your soul, open to receive the grace of God, there will bloom abundant flowers, and you will rejoice with joyful song. And so from this day, we continue our pilgrim journey, seeking the strength that God gives, the understanding of the world around us that comes from the right understanding of God's identity and our identity, so that our lives as pilgrim people may be marked by the joy of walking with the Lord.